Welcome to What's Best Forum's Masters and Makers interview series. If you have not yet subscribed to the channel, please kindly do so. And if you like this interview, please click like. I am happy to be joined today by Daryl Wilson, CEO of Wilson Audio. Good morning, Daryl.
Good morning, and thank you for having me, Ron.
Over time, your top speakers have trended to slightly lower sensitivity and more difficult impedance loads. What design philosophy or sonic objective is driving this trend?
If you go back in Wilson Audio's history, the original WAD actually had a very low impedance. It was right below 2 ohms. So I wouldn't say that it's trending that way. I'd say that the complexity of a system such as a WAM or a Chronosonic XVX with the number of drivers and the number of components involved, there, as my dad would say, there's no free lunch. So you are pursuing the best sound. And in some ways, you're getting the best sound by saying you need a little bit more power and the sensitivity is different or the impedance is different.
In your larger speakers, you have the elaborate mid-range tweeter mid-range arrays that are oriented in the top section of the cabinet with the woofers in the lower section of the cabinet. Why do you prefer that configuration rather than a more tweeter-centered design with the tweeter in the center, the mid-ranges around it, and a woofer at the top and a woofer at the bottom, more of a Diapolito type array?
Yeah, we've experimented with woofers on top and bottom, and sonically for what we are pursuing, it doesn't sound as natural for us. And so we've always had the woofers near the bottom to get the floor reinforcement and to separate the mid-range and the tweeter information at a higher, more ear level presentation. So when it comes down to it, everything we do is, does it sound real? Does it sound natural? Does it sound like we hear in concerts and live unamplified music? If it doesn't fool the mind into thinking that that performer is right in front of you, that helps guide our decision-making process.
So you hear no sonic disadvantage to having the low frequencies coming from the bottom half of the cabinet.
We prefer that. That sounds more natural in the way that, I mean, it really is. My dad had a conversation with a gentleman once. He said, "Dave, I figured it out. I know why your speakers sound so good. It's the mid-range." And he's pointing to one thing. And when you think about a loudspeaker, it's how is it coupled to the floor? What's in the crossover? How's the crossover configured? What's the material of the enclosures? What's the internal volume? And how does the driver that is specifically designed for the system, how does that engage with that space behind the driver? And it's all the wiring, and it's the time domain accuracy. It is so many things. So to try to say, well, it's this thing and this one thing, that this really is the reason why it sounds good or bad. I don't know if that's the most accurate way. I think it's an oversimplification of really how complex a loudspeaker is.
Why do you feel to your ears that dynamic drivers and boxes achieve a more convincing illusion of live music than planar dipole speakers or than horn loudspeakers?
That's a good question because there's so many different options out there. Once again, going back to, in a system, taking all the variables, all the individual components, putting those together. It's like looking at and listening to a symphony orchestra. It's not just the driver or the first violin that makes the presentation so enjoyable. It's not just the timpani player. It's not just the bass. It's not even just the hall. All those are variables. And so balance is essential. Balance is essential between all the players within the system. Drivers, the benefit of utilizing dynamic drivers such as we use and the refinement of those dynamic drivers over decades and decades is the fact that we're able to get it very, very refined and working with known variables. And so our choices, whether it's in the crossovers or the material we use, drivers that we develop, it's all to serve the music at the end of the day. We've experimented and listened to a wide variety of drivers. At the end of the day, does it sound real? Does it sound natural? And will it work within the ecosystem of all the other elements in our loudspeakers?
Much of your company's work and research and effort has been to creating heroically inert cabinets. But why not eliminate the enclosure entirely? Why isn't an open baffle design plausible to achieve the sonic realism you're looking for?
Yeah, yeah. They're very heavy too. We could make them out of styrofoam to make them less heavy. Open baffle design. Now you're working with how does the rear wave interact with the room? Because you are sitting in a room at the end of the day. You're not in an anechoic chamber. And so controlling the rear wave really helps with fine tuning the front wave and the information that's going toward the listener. I'd say that that's the biggest variable.
What is your actual nitty-gritty process for selecting discrete components, resistors, capacitors, inductors? I know you make your own capacitors now. What is that exact process? How do you decide what particular brand of resistor sounds best, what particular value of resistor sounds best?
Wow, that it's a long, very long process. So device under test, DUT, we bring in an element or we identify an element within our system that we'd like to refine. And so we bring in a variety of alternatives. Or we start iterating and we start designing and having prototypes made for us, or we make the prototypes in-house. Let's set all that complexity aside and just say the protocol. You have a variety of DUTs, and we listen to each one of those under similar, same conditions. So the protocol would be if it were not the loudspeaker, let's say it's a binding post or it's a capacitor or resistor. You have the same loudspeaker, you have it set up with the same system, and then you have the ability to switch back and forth between device one and device two. And you're actually listening to its sonic merits. Um, of course, there's all the engineering tests and pushing it to failure and all the other specification stuff. That's one element. The listening to make sure that it sounds as natural and as real as possible, and does it fit within the ecosystem of the loudspeaker? There's kind of a theme here. That's a critical part of evaluating and making sure that we're finding the best components for the system.
What is the reason the driver size of your subwoofers has trended smaller over time, from 18 inches in the XS to 15
Mm,
inches in the Thors hammer to 312 inches in the Subsonics?
speed, speed. The cone surface area, there's no replacement when it comes to pushing air with cone surface area. So there's a balancing act there. Um, with low frequency information, and especially when you're getting down below 35, below 30 hertz, you're getting room rumble. You're getting the sense of space, the things that you don't necessarily hear, but you feel. And you need speed to do that. Now, if we continue the trend down and we're trying to make a subwoofer with 6-inch drivers, it would have the speed, but it wouldn't have the impact. So it's refining what combination of the box, the internal volume, the drivers, all the configurations meets the necessary requirements for the design parameters. Um, so I'd say that speed, if you're seeing a trend there going from 18s to the 12s and configurations in between, it's speed.
What are the pros and cons of the Thors hammer versus the Subsonics? How would you advise a client to select one or the other?
They are both very capable at producing low frequency information and impactful and realistic information. Um, uh, First, people would say, well, the price. There's a big price difference. Um, More components in the subsonic, some more complex. Um, so as far as advising a customer, the subsonic, the actual footprint is slightly smaller than the Thor's hammer. And so if we're trying to fit it into a corner and there's a restriction in space, that would be one parameter. Financially, if a person is saying, hey, this is my budget, that would be another consideration. As far as impact and the ability to recreate like I mentioned, the sense of the hall, as well as the explosions in your movie soundtracks, the subsonics have uh, a little bit more impact. They present a slightly larger sound stage or room stage if you're like in the Musikverein or Staatsoper or a Bravenel Hall here locally in Salt Lake City. That sense of space The subsonics do that a little bit better.
Have you ever considered an explicitly four-tower system where the towers are not optional subwoofers, but rather handle the low frequencies with a separate tower handling the mid-range and treble frequencies?
The original WAM was that way. Yeah, the original WAM had four towers. The WAM front modules handled the high frequencies down to about 100 hertz, and then the woofer towers that were in the back, they were 18-inch woofers at the time. They handled low frequency information, everything below 100 hertz. So that was actually my father's first commercial loudspeaker was the WAM, the original WAM, and it was a four tower system. The WAM Master Chronosonic now it can be a four tower system, but because of some of the limitations of space and what we've learned over almost 5 decades now, the main towers are full range. The subsonics are used very effectively in rooms that get from medium to large size. If you put a WAM in a small size room, the need to have the subsonics at that point is very debatable if it's necessary.
So you see no advantage to bifurcating the woofers and the mid-bass woofers in one tower, the mid-range and tweeters in another tower. You prefer just one column.
Yes, yes. From a time alignment perspective, a full range system having all the driver elements together and close by, and the ability to adjust the upper modules to get that time alignment accuracy, we do prefer to have the woofers right next to the mid ranges.
Have you ever experimented with field coil drivers?
No.
Why do you prefer dome tweeters, the soft dome tweeters, over, say, ribbon tweeters? Have you ever experimented with ribbon tweeters?
Oh yes, yes, lots, and they're phenomenally flat. It's actually very impressive what ribbon tweeters can do. There's no free lunch, so on access they're incredibly flat and linear, and even some of them are extended. But we found in our research, as soon as you take that microphone or listener's ear, as soon as you start taking that off axis, even 1 to 2 degrees, you start getting very extreme roll-offs. And so there's a give and take with using ribbon design. And so and going back to inverted titanium dome tweeters that we used, before, off-axis dispersion characteristics beyond 15 degrees was still very good. The extension was very good, but the dome tweeters, going back to the musicality, going back to you're sitting and listening to the orchestra and the nuances and the harmonic extension of the information coming off the violins and the impact as it rolls through the audience, some of that information is better represented with a dome tweeter than an inverted tweeter. So if you're looking for off-axis dispersion characteristics, linearity off-axis, the inverted dome is actually better than the soft dome tweeter. But it's a balance act. One reason why we have built into our designs the ability for the tweeter module to be more focused and pointing at the listener is that very reason.
How important do you feel is mid-range driver surface area to transparency and realism?
I don't know if I would necessarily equate the two as being exactly hand in hand. We've experimented with and we utilize a 4-inch mid-range, and its optimal operating range is mid-range to to the crossover point with the tweeter, the high frequencies. That one, I don't know. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily that. Okay, let's go back. Mid-range surface area is essential when it comes to low frequency information, when it comes to impact, when it comes to explosions, when it comes to a timpani, a drum hit, the thwack of the drum, and how that propagates through the hall and how it hits you. So surface area is very essential, and the balance of that with low frequency information. When you get into the mid range, you're really looking for sweetness in the mid range, accuracy in the mid range, and so I think that you can successfully do that with a wider range of mid ranges. That doesn't necessarily mean that we'd want to go to an 8-inch mid range per se. But when you're looking at 6 inches down to 4 inches, if it's balanced in the system and that's taken into consideration, I think that a loudspeaker designer can be successful with that. I don't know if I'm answering your question like that. I've never been asked that before as far as, surface area of the mid-range. I've been asked more about materials and, the motor structure and whatnot. So I'm having a hard time answering that one because that's not how we are thinking about choosing a mid-range. It's not what's the surface area and this surface area equals the driver we're going to use. It's all the other elements to blending it with the system.
Well, in fact, I actually think you do value a driver surface, mid-range driver surface area because, in fact, your taller loudspeakers have multiple mid-range drivers.
Yes.
Do you aim generally for an objectively measured flat frequency response when you test the loudspeakers?
That's where we start. That's where we start. I think any loudspeaker worth its weight in salt can get a relatively flat frequency response. Gone are the days where it's, the system is really measured and companies hang their hat on this is a flat system, ergo it's superior. Flat frequency response is one, sensitivity is another one, and really watts are generally speaking cheaper than ever and more readily available than ever. Getting a 250 watt amplifier, 500 watt amplifier is much easier now than it was 20 years ago. So sensitivity is another area where it's like, yeah, it's important, but it's not the thing we hang our hat on. Time domain accuracy is the thing that I think that we do exceptionally well. And I think it's critical to fooling the mind that something's there that's not there. As humans, we're designed to experience the world and to navigate the world around us using time cues. If you're out in the woods and you hear a snap, you hear a twig break, it's not good enough to say, well, it's kind of over in that area. That snap in the woods, it hits one ear, propagates over to the other, and your mind calculates that, and you can really point generally within inches of where that's at, especially if you believe that it's a threat. So the concept of time domain accuracy is something that we've lived with our entire lives, something that we naturally navigate the world with. Building it into loudspeakers is something that I think allows us to take something that inherently has a lot of barriers and a lot of things that could go wrong, and it writes those things to make sure that the presentation of the source material is hitting the listener in a way that is how the artist intended the music to be. If the artist intended the saxophone on this side and the bass guitar here and the drum set in the back, and they intended to have some space in between it, and then it's being played back to you and there's time smear and it's not aligned very well, and your mind's hearing it, and it knows there's a drummer, there's the sax player, but the space between it, the more accurate that is, the more your mind pieces together and hears where those instruments are. So we can go into the emotional side of music and how content is created and whatnot. And that, of course, is for audiophiles. That's a critical element of it. But from a simplicity, sound stage is the easiest way of describing the importance of it.
I know your ultimate reference is live, unamplified acoustic music. When you have a completed prototype and you're listening to it, how do you gauge how close that prototype is to the sonic realism of the reference you're looking for?
It's a lifetime of going to different concert halls, evaluating different recordings. Wilson Audiophile Recordings, my father and mother, they created a recording label and released 33 different albums. I happened to be at a few of those, and we still use some of those recordings as references. So knowing what's on the recording, knowing what it's supposed to sound like. One of the recordings, I was just a baby, but my dad did a microphone check at Grace Cathedral with my mom, and he was swapping out the microphones. I've listened to my mom sing my entire life. There's something about her voice, and any musician where if one thing is off, you can tell it's them, but it doesn't sound like they're there. And using that recording has really benefited a lot of the loudspeakers that we fine-tuned and released in the marketplace. The Chronosonic XVX being one where I was listening to capacitors. We were down at the last stages, and the capacitors were exactly the same value. And it was capacitor configurations. And because we wind our own capacitors here, I worked with the department and said, hey, we want A, B, and C, different, wound differently, wound with different material. And I was able to do ABs. And there is a capacitor that is a certain configuration. When I switched to it, I I had to open my eyes, and I emotionally broke down because she was there. And it's like that there's no I I don't know if we even have the equipment to measure something like that and put a number on it, like a specification, like sensitivity. But emotionally, our bodies respond to what we believe is real. That's what we're searching for with our loudspeaker designs.
Daryl, thank you so much. This has been wonderful.
Yes, thank you, Ron.